and her bowels emptied themselves all over the Abbey floor. She vomited, she urinated, there was feces flowing out everywhere. Now, the only part of the Abbey, or the grounds of the Abbey, that's still used for religious purposes is this church, St James's Church. It's one of the main Roman Catholic churches still here in Reading today, and some of it is actually still built out of some ruins of the Abbey. But what's really important about it is two things. Firstly, I was married here. That's right, guys, sorry people, I'm already married, so I'm off the market, I'm afraid. The only way I'll become single is if my wife dies. Let's hope that never happens, not before me anyway. So the other reason this St James Church is important is because it bears the name of St James, and he's very, very important to Reading, and we're going to find out why in a second. So here we are now inside the Reading Abbey itself. Here you go, look at that, what a magnificent abbey. Now I was just telling you outside about St James and why he was so important for Reading Abbey. I'll get back to him in a second, because before we go with that, I have to tell you a little bit about the story of Matilda the Empress. Now, Matilda the Empress must have had a terrible early childhood in many ways, because as I mentioned earlier, Henry I, her father, married her off to the Holy Roman Emperor when she was just 11 years old. The Holy Roman Emperor, we think, was about 33 at the time. You can imagine that would have been pretty horrible. She became a very powerful and influential woman, though, which is unusual for the Middle Ages. It's a very sexist time. But that sexism still held her back. She was married to the Holy Roman Empire, which was quite a catch for Henry I. For people that don't know, the Holy Roman Emperor was in charge of the Holy Roman Empire, which was the remnants of the Roman Empire, and a large empire based really mostly in Germany and Italy. A huge medieval empire, German empire really, a very powerful man. So a great ally for Henry I, hence the marriage. However, when he died, Matilda came back to Normandy to live with her father, Henry I, and she brought back with her a very special heirloom that was passed down through her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor's family, and it was a relic. And we'll tell you what the relic was in a second, because a relic was a very, very holy object that monasteries loved having. It was usually a body part of a saint, or if you were really lucky, Jesus, or it might be something like a piece of the wooden cross that Jesus was nailed to when he was crucified. And these relics were very important for Roman Catholics, and especially monasteries like Reading Abbey here, because if you had a special holy relic in your monastery, people would come from miles around, sometimes travel across continents to visit your abbey, because they believed if they prayed near this holy object, their prayers would have special powers and they'd be more likely to get into heaven, or their prayers would be more likely to be answered. It's got so bad in some circumstances that pilgrims, that means people that went to abbeys to find these relics and to pray near them, some pilgrims wanted to get up close to the relics and touch them, and it got so bad that at one point monasteries started having to put bars on the boxes around the relics, because people kept crawling in there and kind of rubbing themselves up against the relics for their special holy power they believed they gave them. And once they put the bars on, pilgrims started getting stuck inside the cages that the relics were in. So, yeah, awkward. And Reading Abbey had a great collection of relics, some very bizarre ones as well. And one of them was the hand of St. James, the heirloom that Matilda the Empress had inherited from her dead husband, and she took with her when she came back to Normandy and eventually back to England. I'm just going to give you a little list of some of the great relics apart from St. James's hand, St. James being an early apostle, friend of Jesus, and one of his cousins. Okay, that great hand of St. James, that was just one of the many relics they had there. They had some strange other ones too.
When April with his showers hath pierced the drought of March with sweetness to the very root, and flooded every vein with liquid power, that of its strength engendereth the flower. When Zephyr also with his fragrant breath hath urged to life in every holt and heath new tender shoots of green, and the young sun his full half-course within the ram hath run, and little birds are making melody, that sleep the whole night through with open eye, for in their hearts doth nature stir them so. Then people long on pilgrimage to go, and palmers to be seeking foreign strands, to distant shrines renowned in sundry lands.
So as well as the hand of St. James, Reading Abbey had lots of other relics. They had a piece of the true cross, Jesus' sandal. They had one of the hairs of the Virgin Mary, Jesus' mother. They also had, they said, and I believe them 100%, they had Jesus' foreskin. Now, Jesus being Jewish obviously would have been circumcised when he was a young man, and somehow, they don't say how, but his foreskin, a very holy relic, ended up here at Reading Abbey. Now, it's a bit awkward here because lots of other abbeys and cathedrals and monasteries around Europe at the time claimed to have Jesus' foreskin. 17 of them claimed to have Jesus' foreskin. They were all lying. Reading Abbey had his real foreskin. Anyone that tells you different is a liar. So with this collection of hairs, bits of wood, hands and foreskins, the Reading Abbey became a very, very important pilgrimage site for pilgrims all over Europe. And it became very wealthy because when you were a pilgrim and you came here, you didn't just come here to pray, but you would also donate money to the monastery. You'd stay in the town, you'd spend your money. And so the abbeys were like huge, almost like tourist attractions. And really, that's the point at which Reading was most important as a place. Because this importance of the abbey meant that many other massively important things happened here. You had royal weddings. John of Gaunt, very important man who was a regent. He ran the country when his father was too sick to be as king to run the country, and his nephew, the heir to the throne, was too young to run it. He was married here. Famously murdered and martyred Archbishop Thomas Becket opened the abbey here. And many people were married here and buried here who were very, very important people. It was also the site of a parliament. One of the English parliaments took place at Reading Abbey, so the laws were made here, and it was a very important location. And crucially as well, it was the site of the burial of the king, Henry I. And in this area here is probably where he was buried, around about here, because this is the high altar section of the abbey, the most holy and most important part of the abbey, and actually stretches further behind this bit of ruin here, behind into that kind of area over there, which is no longer part of the abbey ruins anymore. So his burial was probably somewhere in this direction, so we're going to go and have a look at that next. So we were just inside the abbey and we were looking at the different parts of it, and the most important part of the abbey is the high altar. It's the most the religious part and the most spiritually important part of the abbey. You can just see the end of the abbey here, over there, sorry. But actually, if you're a king like Henry, when you die, well, you want to be buried in the abbey that you founded. Then you're sure to go to heaven if you're buried there, if you're close to the high altar, the most holy part of such a holy place. But unfortunately, when the abbey was knocked down, most of its ruins, most of where it was, became other things and became other places. And so the high altar where Henry I was buried and is buried is no longer in the actual Abbey ruins anymore. In fact, the place where Henry I is most likely to be buried is right under this car park here. This spot in the car park of Reading Prison, former Reading Prison, is the most likely spot where Henry I is buried. Let's just get down a little bit closer to Henry, because if you rub the car park long enough, and if you really take in the essence of this car park, you can really sense the pomp, the pageantry, the power of Henry I coming in through this granite and asphalt mixed floor, and you can just sense that Henry I is buried there. What an important car park this is. What a great legacy that the Reading Borough Council and the English and we as a country have shown to our history and our monarchy by, you know, covering this king's grave in some very ample parking opportunities. Sensational. So how did Matilda end up bringing this heirloom that she had, the hand of St. James, one of the holiest relics in Europe at the time, to Reading Abbey? Well, when her brother got on a ship from France to England, he was the heir to the English throne at the time. Unfortunately, the ship he got on he shared that ship with about 300 other binge drinkers, and there was so much alcohol consumed in the days or in the hours leading up to this ship's voyage that it resulted in the ship's sinking. Sometimes in England, when you go on a holiday, there's people drinking in the departure lounge of the airport heavily. Maybe they're going on stag do's or summer parties, things like that, and this tradition goes back clearly to this ship's voyage, because there was so much binge drinking that took place before that voyage that the ship sunk and took down with it the heir to the English throne. As a result, Henry I had to find a new heir to his throne. First he tried to make a new one, a new male one, should we say, but that wasn't going to work, so he ended up marrying Matilda off a second time. The Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire being now dead, he married Matilda off a second time. She was early 20s, 23, 24, we're not exactly sure when she was born, and she married a 14-year-old, Geoffrey. Unfortunately for her though, even though Henry made many lords and many people, important people in England, swear loyalty to her as the heir to the throne, because of the sexism of the time, the church didn't really want her to be Queen of England. Lords who had promised oaths of loyalty to her betrayed her, and in addition to that, when she did eventually, in the civil war known as the Anarchy, get control of London, she tried to get herself crowned Queen at Westminster Abbey, but a mob of people in London stopped that coronation taking place, and so she had to flee. She was involved in various civil wars, and she was tenacious. She led armies, she was put in prison, but she always fought her corner. So well done, Matilda. And the most important thing she did for Reading was she brought that heirloom of her first husband's family and left it here at Reading Abbey, the hand of St. James, to accompany her dead father and help his soul's journey into heaven. So, thank you, Matilda, for that heirloom. Now I know what you're thinking. There's a question you wanted to ask me. Did any of these relics actually work? Did they give you special religious powers? Well, there is one story of a woman from Earley. It's a little village just outside Reading at the time and a suburb of Reading now. And she had a disease or an illness known as dropsy. That's what it was called at the time. Nowadays we think it was some sort of bowel condition which meant you couldn't go to the toilet. And your kind of bowels filled up with urine and feces and things like that. Now she went to Reading Abbey to try and use the relics to heal her of her dropsy, and there's a story of how she at one point, just before the monks were starting to sing their matins, which is kind of sung prayers at the end of the day, she fell down in the abbey near the cross pieces and near the relics of the hand of St. James, and she started writhing around in the floor in agony as if a spirit had taken control of her body. And then she all of a sudden let out a great cry, and her bowels emptied themselves all over the Abbey floor. She vomited, she urinated, there was feces flowing out everywhere, and it was absolutely disgusting. But she felt much better and she was cured. So perhaps there is something in the story of the hand of St. James. Who knows? Now, because most of the Abbey is now ruined, it's kind of hard to get the impression of how expensive and how grand it would have been. But you can get a bit of an impression here, because you can see here the last remaining part of Reading Abbey that is still resembling what it looked like when the Abbey was standing. This is the Abbey gate on Abbott's Walk. Abbot is someone who's in charge of an abbey. Okay, so this is a little bit of what the Abbey would have looked like. It's quite an impressive build, similar to like a castle. Lovely bit of stonework there, some faces in the corners of the building, and you can see they spent a lot of money. Lovely sandstone. Let's see if anybody's in. Doesn't look like it. Let's try the other door. Hello? No one home. Oh well, we'll have to come back another time. See if we can locate any Abbott's monks who might still be lingering around these parts of the Abbey. Well, the question is, how did this all end after hundreds of years of prayer and religion at the Abbey? How did the Abbey become a ruin? Well, towards the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period, kind of the 16th century, many people decided that actually maybe monks weren't quite leading the religious life they were claiming to lead. You remember I mentioned Friar Tuck in the Robin Hood story? Well, he's called Friar Tuck. Tuck is kind of an English slang word for food because he liked his food a lot. And actually a lot of monks did the same. A lot of monks ate a lot. They were pretty greedy. They drank a lot. Some of them even had girlfriends. And even today, a lot of monasteries, monks even today, produce a lot of food and drink and wine. For example, Buckfast, the famous strong fortified wine, a drink favoured by the Glaswegian working class, is made in an abbey in the West Country. But here you see behind me a famous pub in Reading called the Monks' Retreat. I don't know whether monks retreated there at the time of the Abbey. I certainly, in my youth, spent a lot of time imbibing and cavorting in this establishment. But monks were doing this too much, and Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry VIII's key advisors, he was a Protestant, and he didn't believe that the monasteries should have the money and the power and apparently the lack of faith that they had. Henry VIII's new wife, Anne Boleyn, was also a Protestant, and together with Henry they decided to get rid of the monasteries, to take their land and to take their wealth. And that was very handy for Henry because he needed the money. And so the abbot, the leader of Reading Abbey, he didn't like this very much. We're going to go back down Friar Street, back down to the Reading Abbey gate that's still standing there, to find out what happened to the abbot of Reading Abbey. Well, here you see Hugh Cook, the last abbot of Reading Abbey. Now, Hugh Cook disagreed with Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII that they had the right to close down Reading Abbey. And you might think this is just to do with wealth and power on his part, but to be fair to the monasteries, they also provided care for the poor, care for the sick, and care for the old. So even if you don't believe in all the relics and everything like that, and to a certain extent the corruption of it, they were like an early form of welfare state, the monasteries. And when they were closed by Henry VIII, there was a huge explosion in homelessness, poverty, and vagrants and people touring the countryside because they had nowhere else to go. And we're just going to have a look now at the spot in which he was hung, drawn and quartered, because Hugh Abbott was accused of treason for questioning the king's right to close the abbey, and he was hung, drawn and quartered in front of the gate, probably on this spot here where the manhole cover is. He was hung till he was half dead, then he had his genitalia cut off. This was symbolic to show that he couldn't sire any more treasonous children like him. Then his guts were cut out and burnt in front of him while he was still alive. Then he was finally, hopefully dead by this point, he was chopped into 4 parts, and the 4 parts of his body were sent to the places where he'd lived and was born, and displayed to the public to show that this is what happens to you when you go against the crown, the King of England. This is what happens to you. Okay, so that's how Reading Abbey finally ended. That's land belonging to the king with a dead abbot.